In this video, we're going to work on our next screen, so let's get to it. Let's take a look at a mockup. Okay, so here's what we're going to try to build. I want to build 3 separate sections inside of one screen. Each individual section is going to show a little picture on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side will be a single word to describe the picture. So for example, the first one might show a picture of a forest, and we'll show the text forest on the right, then a beach, and a picture of a mountain, and the text mountain. Now, this might seem like a very simple application, but I want to demonstrate a very critical thing to understand about React. You see, when we start to build this thing out, there's a couple of different ways we could do it. The first easy way that you might think of would be to create a new screen, which we've done several times now, and inside there, just throw all the JSX required to repeat those 3 elements 3 times. So we would end up with like 3 very similar looking blocks of JSX inside of this new screen component. Alternatively, to save a little bit of code and save ourselves a little bit of effort, we could instead create a separate component and then show that component 3 times on the single screen. Each time we show that component, we could pass in some configuration options or props to customize how that component gets displayed. So in other words, we might create one new component called image screen, and then separately, we might create a new component called image detail. This image detail thing would be responsible for showing one of these individual cards that has an image and some text next to it. Now, each of these image detail components would probably need to show a different image and some different piece of text. So we could customize how these different components are displayed by passing them some props from the image screen down to the image detail. So let's give this a shot. Along the way, you're going to learn a lot around making reusable components and passing down props to customize how they work. All right, so I'll flip back over to my code editor. The first thing I'm going to do is create a new file inside my screens directory. And I'm going to call this imagescreen.js. Then inside of here, we'll put together a little bit of boilerplate. So I'll say import React from React. I'll import view, text, and style sheet from React Native. I'll do a const image screen. And for right now, inside that function, I will return just a little piece of text that says like image screen. After that, I'll create a style sheet. And then finally, we will export default the image screen. Okay, so again, that's a little bit of boilerplate that we're going to get very used to writing out, as we're going to essentially write that out for every single component we ever create. All right, now remember, if we want this to actually show up on our screen or inside of our application, we need to wire that thing up to our app.js file. So as a little exercise, I would like for you to try to wire up that new screen, this image screen thing right here, to our app.js file. After connecting it to the app.js file, try to display a button to navigate to that new screen from the home screen. So you'll essentially duplicate the current button element that we have right here inside of our home screen and make sure that it navigates over to the new image screen that you have connected to this navigator. As usual, this is 100% optional. If you don't want to do this on your own, no problem. Just skip over to the next video. All right, hopefully you had some success in hooking up the image screen to our navigator and getting a button to display on the home screen as well. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. All right, so I'm inside my app.js file. At the very top, I'm going to import the image screen that we just created from source, screens, image screen. I'll then hook it up to my route configuration object right here. So I'll do something like image is image screen. So that's all we should have to do to hook up that screen to our navigator object. So now the only other thing we have to do is open up our home screen and make sure there's a new button inside there that we can use to tap and show the image screen that we just created. So I'll open up that homescreen.js file. Here it is right here. I'm going to duplicate one of the buttons. So I'll copy that button and paste it right underneath. I'll change the title from go to list demo to something like go to image demo instead. The title doesn't matter. So if you use a different title here, that's totally fine. We'll then make sure that we update our navigate call. Remember, this navigate call tells the React navigation library which component we want to show on the screen. We just hooked up that image screen called image. So we want to navigate to image. So back over here on the new button, I will change the list to image with a capital I. Okay, let's save this and try it out. So I'll save it. I can now see that new button right there. and I'll double check on Android as well. And I can click on that link, and I can see the image screen. Perfect. Okay, now that we've got that wired up, let's continue in the next video. In this video, we're going to create a new reusable component that we're going to call image detail. This image detail is going to be responsible for just showing one of these individual little cards right here. So let's try this out. I'm going to flip back over to my code editor. Now inside of our code editor, specifically inside the src directory, we currently have a folder called screens. Inside there, we have a bunch of different React components that are meant to display a full screen's worth of content. So in other words, it's like one distinct component, and we want this component and this component alone to be visible on a device. Anytime that we want to make some kind of reusable component that we expect to reuse several times over, we'll create it inside of a separate directory called simply components. So the idea here is that we're going to have one set of React components called screens that show an entire screen's worth of content, like everything on the device. And then we'll also have a collection of different components called simply components, and that's going to show just one little portion of what goes on the screen. That might sound kind of confusing for right now, but over time, you're going to really come to learn the difference between a screen and a reusable component. Okay, so inside my src directory, I'll make a new folder called components. So inside of here, we're going to put all of our different reusable components that we want to show several times. Then inside there, I'll make a new file called imagedetail.js. So inside of here, we're going to write out the same boilerplate that we've been using for all of our different screens. Rather than rewrite it all out from great detail or from scratch right now, we can just flip back over to our image screen, do a quick select all and copy, and then paste that inside of image detail like so. So I'm inside of image detail, and I've got all that boilerplate inside of here. We can then fix up the variable name here. So rather than creating a function called image screen, I'll call it image detail instead. And I'll update the export default at the bottom as well. Then finally, inside this text element, I'm going to change it from image screen to image detail. All right, so we've now got a screen called image screen and a component called image detail. So now we want to try to show that image detail component several times, or we want to show several copies of it inside of our image screen. So let's figure out how to do that. To show one component inside of another, we're first going to go into the parent component file. So in this case, it's going to be the image screen. So here's my image screen. Inside of here, we're going to import the component that we want to show several times. So at the top, underneath my import from React Native, I will import image detail from, and we have to write out a relative path to that component file. Right now, our image screen file is inside the screens directory. So we have to go up one directory to src, then into the components directory, and then get the image detail file. So to do so, we will write out .. to indicate that we want to go up one directory. We'll then go into the components folder and get the image detail file. Okay, so we've now imported the child into the parent. So now to show this child inside of the parent, we're going to pretend that this image detail is just like those primitive elements that we've been making use of from the React Native library. So we can write out image detail inside of a set of JSX tags. Right now, we're showing a single text element right here inside of image screen. Because we want to show multiple different image details, remember, we always have to return one single root element. So inside of here, I'm going to place a view. And then inside there, I'm going to place several copies of my image detail. That's the component that we just created that we want to reuse several times. So I'll do image detail. Notice I'm using a self-closing tag here because I don't expect to have to pass anything into it. I'll then copy that down a couple times, like so. So now hopefully, if we save this and test out our application, we should see image detail appear 4 times. So let's try that. I'll save it. I'll flip back over. I'll navigate to the image demo, and I'll see image detail repeated 4 separate times. Perfect. Now to just do a little bit of a further test here and make sure that everything is really working correctly, let's try putting some text inside of here besides image detail. So I'll put in something like show image of forest. I'll then save that, go back to the image demo screen, and I'll see that new text repeated 4 times once again. Okay, so this looks pretty good. So we are now showing our image detail multiple times inside of one single parent element. So now we need to figure out how we can pass some props from the parent down to the child to customize how this child component displays itself and shows it to a user. Okay, so let's take care of that prop stuff in the next video. In the last video, we showed several copies of our image detail inside of the image screen. So now we want to customize each of these different image details and show some slightly different content. Remember, to do so, we're going to pass a props object from the image screen down to the image detail. Let's figure out how we do that. All right, so I'm back inside of my image screen.js file. Inside of here, I'm going to find each of those different image detail elements. So I've got 4 inside of here right now. I'm going to add in a prop to the first one right here. I'm going to make up a prop name off the top of my head. Remember, on just about all those other primitive elements we've used so far, we've had props like title or onPress. Those were all very special prop names. If we wanted those primitive elements to work correctly, we had to use some very special name, a very specific name with a very certain spelling and capitalization. But in this case, you and I are adding in some props of our own. We're making these up on our own. These are not some predefined props. So I think that if I want to customize, say, the text right here that is displayed, maybe an appropriate name for that configuration option would be like title. So I think I will call this prop title. I'll then pass in some value for that property. So the first one could be forest, like so. So just to be clear, when you and I create a component, as we did right here, we can choose any prop name that we want. This could be title, or it could be text, or it could be image name, or whatever else. But I think title definitely makes some sense. Okay, so we can now save this. And then if we go back over to our image detail, we now have to receive that prop inside of here. So we've now essentially passed some information from the parent down to the child. Remember, when we pass information from a parent to the child, we're using that prop system. So it's going to show up as an object inside that child component. So inside of image detail, the first argument to this function will be our props object. Let's try doing a console log of that props object right now, just to see what it looks like. Okay, so I'll save this. I'll then go back to my image demo, and I'll check out my terminal and see what that console log is. Okay, so we see 4 separate console logs here. We see 4 separate console logs because I'm currently showing the image detail component 4 separate times. That means we are creating 4 separate copies of that component. The first one has a console log of an object that says title is forest. We see this because the first element that I placed of the image detail, I passed in a prop of title and I gave it a value of forest. I did not provide any other props to those other 3 copies, which is why we see an empty object here instead. Let's go back over to our image screen and add in some props to each of those. Then we can see an updated console log that hopefully will have a title property for each separate one. So back inside of image screen, I'm going to add in a title for the second one of beach, and then a title of mountain. And I think we'll just do 3 separate image details, so I'm going to delete the 4th one. Okay, so we now have 3 separate copies of image detail being created. Each one is going to have a very different and separate props object. Each copy of image detail that is created is 100% disconnected from the others, and they don't have any ability to really very easily communicate with each other. So we can really imagine that our image detail function right here is being executed 3 separate times. So let's now save this once again. I'm going to go back to my image demo to make sure those console logs actually get executed. And then once again, I'll check out my terminal. And here we go. So I now see the 3 separate console logs. Each one has a props object that has a title property and a value of forest, then beach, and then mountain. Once again, this prop system is how we configure a child component. The parent is going to pass down some data from the parent down to the child. So now that we've got this data inside the child, we can use this data to somehow customize the JSX that is returned. So back inside of image detail, we can now remove that console log. And rather than printing out some text right here of just show image of forest, we can replace it with a reference to that title property inside that props object. So inside of here, because we want to print out a JavaScript variable, we'll put in those curly braces, and then we can do props.title, like so. So let's save this one more time and test it out once again. Back inside of my emulator, I'll hit go to image demo, and now we will see forest, beach, and mountain. Okay, so that's pretty much it. We're going to use this prop system to configure a child component several times, well, I should say many times inside this course. Every time that we want to configure or make a reusable component, we're going to configure it by passing some props into it from the parent component. So in this case, we're going to pass not only a title property down into image detail, we'll probably also eventually pass in an image property as well. And we'll specify exactly what image should be shown inside of each of these different image details.